Okay, well, let's continue on with learning goal number 3. What is the veterinary importance of mosquitoes? In regards to animal health, one of the most important and perhaps underrated aspects of mosquitoes is the annoyance, blood loss, and allergic reactions that they cause through their blood feeding behavior, the combined effects of which can stress the animals as well as lead to reduced growth and productivity if we're talking about livestock. And these images below show you some examples of a horse and a dog with their face and head covered in a swarm of mosquitoes. You can imagine the annoyance and discomfort that this can cause if they're being perpetually bitten by mosquitoes. Now, this is an issue that's also relevant to human health and quality of life, as mosquitoes can reduce the amount of time that humans spend outdoors, as well as their enjoyment of outdoor activities during mosquito season. And you can think of this as being especially relevant in areas that rely on tourism and outdoor activities as part of their economy. So if you're in an area that relies on an influx of people during hunting season or fishing season, and they have to face swarms of mosquitoes like this, you're going to have a substantially lower number of people participating in those activities and potentially affecting economic growth. And to continue on with this theme of annoyance and blood loss and its consequences, there have been news reports of mosquitoes suffocating cows. This news story, you can click on the link below to get the full story. But in summary, it claims that mosquitoes were so dense in a pasture near Naples, Florida, in the year 1988 that they drank enough blood from the cows to significantly weaken them and eventually suffocate them by occluding their nasal passages. Now, this news story may sound hard to believe, but I think after I share with you this brief video clip below, you'll see that exsanguination and perhaps suffocation are not that unrealistic if the swarms of mosquitoes can reach high enough densities.
With predator populations booming, the Arctic still has room for one more. Now emerging from the ponds and lakes. The tiniest of the Arctic hunters, mosquitoes. It's a good time to be anywhere but here. The mosquitoes feed on anything in their path. The warm-blooded victims must sit and bear several miserable weeks of stinging bites. But the mosquitoes are more than a misery. In such numbers, they can drain enough blood to fell a caribou, and sometimes even kill it. The caribou are forced off their grazing grounds by a predator 10 million times smaller than they are. The herds try to find refuge on the coldest patches where mosquitoes will not venture. But soon, hunger will force the caribou back to the grazing grounds with their clouds of tiny tormentors.
In addition to annoyance, blood loss, and allergic reactions, mosquitoes have a veterinary impact due to their ability to transmit a variety of pathogens, primarily arboviruses, protozoans, and filarial nematodes. In Module 1, we already discussed a few mosquito-borne diseases such as Eastern equine encephalitis and heartworm, and we will briefly review those here, as well as introduce a few others. Now, among the arboviral pathogens that mosquitoes transmit to animals, the equine viral encephalitis complexes are some of the more important ones, especially for equine health, as their name suggests. Examples of such viruses in the United States include Eastern equine encephalitis, or triple E, as well as Western equine encephalitis, WEE. And these viruses are most common east and west of the Mississippi River, respectively, as shown on this map below. Another important example in the Western Hemisphere is Venezuelan equine encephalitis, or VEE. This is a virus that occurs throughout Latin America, as indicated on this map. However, its presence has also been documented in the United States and Florida, and there are concerns about the range of this virus expanding further north into the United States. Now, these encephalitis viruses are not only a problem for the Western Hemisphere, they are also an issue in the Eastern Hemisphere, and a good example of that is Japanese encephalitis, whose range you can see highlighted in red. Now, moving beyond the equine encephalitis viruses, West Nile virus is another important mosquito-borne virus, which is now a global disease. You can see the countries highlighted in yellow are those where West Nile virus cases occur. And this virus has had a huge impact on equine health in the United States, as well as on wild bird populations. And I want to emphasize that I expect you to read reading assignment number 1, which goes into detail about how West Nile virus affected equine health in the United States and efforts to curb its transmission. Another important mosquito-borne virus that affects animal health that's worth mentioning is Rift Valley fever, which is primarily found in Africa. The countries in blue are those in where outbreaks of Rift Valley fever have been reported. The countries in green are also ones where cases have been reported. Rift Valley fever is a major concern to livestock producers in Africa, as outbreaks of this virus have led to catastrophic losses of livestock productivity, and it can also infect humans. Now, in general, the transmission cycle for all of the viruses I mentioned are quite similar, so I'm not going to review them all. And if you go back to Module 1, you can get details on the transmission cycle of Eastern equine encephalitis. So here I just wanted to briefly review the transmission cycle for West Nile virus, which, similar to Eastern equine encephalitis, undergoes a propagative transmission cycle, meaning that it replicates in the arthropod vector before it is transmitted to a vertebrate host. Now, normally West Nile virus exists in an enzootic cycle between bird reservoirs or amplifying hosts and the mosquito vectors. But as with triple E, episodic events can occur, leading to the infection of horses or humans. Now, both horses and humans are dead-end hosts, thus the virus is not able to replicate to sufficient levels for additional transmission to mosquitoes. But it can cause a very serious and fatal illness in horses as well as people, because West Nile virus is a neurotropic virus, meaning that it attacks the nervous system. Now, the good news for West Nile virus and most of the other viruses I've mentioned, except for Rift Valley fever, is that effective vaccines are available for livestock. So vaccination, especially in horses, is key to preventing these illnesses. Now, in addition to arboviruses, mosquitoes are well known as being vectors of protozoan pathogens. The one that you've most likely heard of is malaria in humans, which is the deadliest arthropod-borne disease on the planet. At times, it has killed over 1 million people each year. Below shows you a map from 2010 on the number of reported deaths of malaria by country. And you can see that in some countries in Africa, there were over 1 million deaths in 2010 alone. And the malaria disease is caused by a single-celled protozoan parasite of the genus Plasmodium. Now, these parasites are only transmitted to humans and other vertebrate animals through the bite of mosquitoes. This slide shows you the complex transmission cycle of malaria in humans, but it is also highly relevant to malaria transmission in other animals. The transmission cycle of malaria is most similar to trypanosomiasis, another protozoan-based disease that we learned about in modules number 1 and 4. Thus, similar to trypanosomiasis, malaria undergoes a cyclopropagative transmission cycle where it undergoes transformations and amplification within the arthropod vector before it is transmitted to a vertebrate host. And this life cycle figure shows you those transformations and amplifications that occur in which the gametocytes transform into the ookinete and oocyst stage, where they then transform to sporozoites, which amplify, and the sporozoites are the ones that are eventually transmitted to the vertebrate host through the bite of a mosquito. Notably, while in the vertebrate host, the sporozoites will invade a somatic tissue such as the liver, in which they undergo additional replication and transformation until they reach a blood stage. And when they're in the blood, they'll infect red blood cells where they undergo further maturation and amplification. And it's in this blood, when they're in this blood stage is when the typical symptoms of malaria take place, such as fatigue, anemia, and fever. And these symptoms are caused by the rupturing of the red blood cells by the malaria parasites. So this electron micrograph shows you some human blood. Here are the normal red blood cells, and here are two that are infected by the malaria parasites. So you can see if this is occurring en masse, what a devastating effect it can have on the health of an infected person or animal for that matter. Now, one of the more important types of malaria that occurs in animals is known as avian malaria. The introduction of avian malaria to Hawaii in the early 20th century contributed to the extinction of several endemic bird species there. And this disease continues to threaten endangered species. Some notable examples are this Hawaiian finch on the left, which went extinct, and the crested honey creeper, which is an endangered species that still exists today, but there are some grave concerns over whether or not it's going to be able to hold off from becoming extinct. Avian malaria also has important health impacts on captive penguins in zoos, and outbreaks of avian malaria in penguins in zoos often makes news given how beloved penguins are by the public. And you can see highlighted below a few examples of such stories, and you can click on these images in your slides to go to the full news stories. And I wanted to share with you a brief video clip that discusses some efforts that are being made by a zoo in the United Kingdom to monitor the risk of their penguin colony for avian malaria, which again is a mosquito-borne problem.
Avian malaria is all around us in wild birds. It is caused by a parasite, Plasmodium, and it's not infectious for humans, but it can kill birds. So some bird species, like these penguins, are very susceptible. We don't really know why. Might be they adapted to a cold and windy environment where mosquitoes are rare, but in the UK we have a much milder climate, and probably they didn't have the chance to evolve together with this parasite, so they can't cope when they get infected here. There are a couple of different ways to protect penguins from malaria. and we could shelter them overnight when mosquitoes are more active, or we could use mosquito nets. Here in Viker Zoo we use anti-malarial drugs in the mosquito season, and we never had any outbreaks. However, we were not sure whether this is because of this preventative treatment or we are just lucky. So that's why we set up a research project together with the University of Nottingham, and we would like to know more about the risks for our penguins.
I've been working here at the zoo for about a month on a grant from the Microbiology Society. In the morning I collect the traps. We take them back to the lab to see what insects we've caught and see if we've got any potential mosquitoes. The most likely matches we then send off to another lab for DNA sequencing to find out the species. We haven't found any mosquitoes yet from our traps, but the next step will be to blood sample some of the penguins here and find out if there's any avian malaria parasite in their blood.
Avian malaria is a big threat for birds, both in the wild and in zoos. Humboldt penguins are vulnerable as a species, but also climate change can cause that mosquitoes will increase their range, and they can pose an even bigger stress for wild birds in the future. Therefore, it's important to protect both these guys and others in the wild.
Okay, and the last, but certainly not least, mosquito-borne veterinary problem that I'll mention is heartworm. As we learned about in Module 1, heartworm is a disease that's caused by filarial nematodes that are transmitted to dogs by mosquitoes. And given that we've already reviewed the heartworm life cycle in Module 1, I'm only going to provide a brief review here. Now, heartworm is a disease that primarily affects canines that's prevalent throughout the United States. And as you can see from this map below, it is most abundant in the southeastern U.S., where you see the highest number of cases per clinic being reported. Notably, pet owners in the U.S. spend over $1.2 billion each year on heartworm preventatives. So if you or your family purchase those monthly tablets from your veterinarian to prevent heartworm, you are feeling the economic impact that mosquitoes have on us through the transmission of this filarial nematode. And I wanted to emphasize how important the consistent use of these heartworm preventatives is to preventing this disease from affecting your own companion animals. There would be a lot more red on this map if pet owners did not use heartworm preventatives. Now, as we learned in Module 1, heartworm is caused by filarial nematodes, Dirofilaria imidis, that are characterized by a cyclodevelopmental transmission cycle, and that means they undergo a developmental change in the arthropod vector but do not amplify in that vector. As this image below shows, mosquitoes acquire the larvae of these nematodes from infected dogs, and within the mosquito vector, the larvae will develop to an infective stage, which can then be transmitted to a dog upon its next blood meal. Within the canine host, the larvae will further develop and will eventually lodge themselves into the pulmonary circulation, where they're going to grow in size and further mature until they become adults that can reproduce and spawn additional larvae. As the adults grow in size, they occupy more and more of the pulmonary circulation, leading to devastating consequences on heart and lung function. As you can imagine, when you see this image on the right of an extreme heartworm infestation in a dog. So the heart and pulmonary circulation can be completely occluded by these worms, which would have obvious drastic consequences on blood flow. Now, it's also important to mention that cats can also acquire heartworm from mosquitoes, but cats are dead-end hosts for the worms, meaning that they cannot complete their life cycle. And with that, I just wanted to share with you a brief video clip that summarizes the heartworm life cycle.
The health of dogs is at risk from heartworms, a major parasite transmitted by infected mosquitoes. The infection of the dog starts with an infected mosquito taking a blood meal. Infective third-stage larvae, L3, of the parasite Dirofilaria immitis are deposited on the surface of the dog's skin. Immediately afterwards, these L3 larvae, about 1 millimeter long at this stage, enter the dog's body using the puncture wound left behind by the insect. In the dermis, the heartworm larvae undergo the next stage of their life cycle and molt into L4 larvae as early as 3 days post-infection. During the following weeks, the L4 larvae migrate through the tissues of the dog. At day 50 to 70 post-infection, L4 larvae molt into immature adults. As early as 70 days post-infection, the immature adults migrate into the dog's venous bloodstream, which transports them towards the heart and lungs of the dog. By day 120, after the initial infection, they all have arrived in the small pulmonary blood vessels. At this point, the immature adult heartworms are about 1 to 1.5 inches in length. They now begin to grow massively, pushing into larger and larger pulmonary blood vessels until some of them finally end up in the pulmonary artery, close to the heart. An inflammatory process within the pulmonary vessel and surrounding pulmonary tissue is elicited by the parasite. This progressively leads to pathology of the lung and the blood vessels, ultimately resulting in vascular resistance or pulmonary hypertension. With higher worm burdens, right heart hypertrophy develops, leading in the long term to right-sided heart failure and potentially to the death of the affected animal. Heartworms are also responsible for a marked increase in the dog's risk of thromboembolism. Once a worm dies, it can block a smaller pulmonary vessel completely, resulting in the infarction of the surrounding tissue. About 7 to 9 months post-infection, the adult, now sexually mature female worms start producing offspring. The microfilaria stage L1 of Dirofilaria immitis. These microfilaria circulate in the cardiovascular system of the infected dog, ready to be ingested with the blood meal of a feeding mosquito. Inside the insect, over a period of about 14 days, the L1 larvae develop into the infective L3 stage larva by molting twice. This mosquito is now a new vector of heartworm infection, threatening the lives of dogs and cats in endemic areas.
And with that video clip concludes learning goal number 3 for mosquitoes. Please remember to continue topic 7-1, watching the guest lecture by Dr. Will Reeves on the Serrata Pagonidae, and then continue on to topic 7-2, which will cover the myiasis flies. But before you move on to the Serrata Pagonidae, you may want to stick around for a few more minutes to learn just a little bit more about mosquitoes and how to prevent them.
Did you know in just 1 week, a mosquito can go from egg to adult? And I'm here to tell you what you can do once a week to prevent this from happening. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health. Hello world, it's Metamorphosis on your station. I'm here to share with you just a bit of information, like why female mosquitoes like to bite, because they use your blood to lay eggs at another site. So watch out for that flying mosquito, make you itch and scratch like a wrecking needle. To prevent this from happening, biorepellent at your local pharmacy is where they sell it. EPA registered, CDC recommended. Disease control is what's intended to prevent you from getting West Nile and the Zika virus. Help your community not be a high risk. And make sure that your pool pump is working. And don't forget the chlorine, now it's really working. And don't leave standing water in water buckets. And even in ponds, that water's not to be trusted. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health. You gotta dump the water out, drain the water flow, tip the water out, toss the water slow. Let's all pitch in and help. Good for the environment and good for your health.